Hello, dreamer. Tonight, let me take you to a world of snow and starlight, where beneath a frozen lake, a tiny dragon awakens. Together with a wandering prince, it embarks on a journey through icy forests and forgotten whispers, seeking warmth and hope. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the gentle rhythm of this story guide you into a peaceful slumber. Let's begin. Beneath the eternal silence of an ancient frozen lake, something stirred. The lake was older than the tallest pines that bowed to the icy wind, older than the mountains whose jagged peaks pierced the clouds. It was a realm untouched, save for the whispers of the cold and the occasional wanderer who dared venture too close to its frozen heart. Deep within the ice, in a cavern untouched by sunlight, a single crystalline egg lay embedded. For centuries, or perhaps longer, it had slumbered, locked in stillness, its faint glow lost in the void of frost. Then, on a night when the snow fell thick as feathers and the moon hid its face behind a veil of cloud, a crack split the silence. The egg pulsed once, faint as the breath of a dying star. A second crack followed, and then another, the sound sharp and crystalline, like breaking glass. The glow inside the egg flared, a fleeting ember in a sea of blue. From within, a creature emerged. A tiny dragon, no larger than a sparrow, with scales the pale silver of moonlight. Its wings were delicate, filigreed like frost patterns on a winter pane, and its eyes, wide and shimmering, reflected a world it had never seen. For a moment, it stood motionless, trembling on its fragile legs. Its breath emerged in a thin plume of steam that dissolved into the frozen air. The lake's voice was the first thing it heard, a soft, resonant whisper, as if the ice itself spoke. Flee, little spark. Dawn will seal your fate. Without warmth, you will become one with the frost, your flame extinguished forever. The dragon shivered, its body cold and brittle as the ice beneath its claws. Its heartbeat was faint, an ember struggling against a growing darkness. Something deep within it, instinct, or perhaps fear, pushed it forward. With unsteady steps, the dragon climbed out of its crystalline cradle, slipping on the slick surface of the cavern. Above, the frozen lake was a labyrinth of shifting blues and whites, its surface crisscrossed with veins of silver where the ice had cracked over centuries. The dragon felt the cold seeping deeper, numbing its limbs, slowing its fragile heart. But the whispering voice pressed it onward. The forest will shelter you. There is warmth in the woods, if you are brave enough to seek it. The dragon lifted its head, its small chest heaving with the effort. A faint glow broke through the layers of ice, a flicker of moonlight guiding its way. It stumbled, clawing its way upward, until at last it emerged onto the surface of the lake. The night was vast and cruel. The wind howled across the expanse, carrying flurries of snow that stung like needles. The dragon's wings fluttered weakly, its fragile body too cold to lift from the ground. Around it, the lake stretched endlessly, a desolate sea of ice and shadow. For the first time, the dragon felt despair. It was too small, too frail to survive. The warmth it sought was nowhere to be found, only the biting cold that threatened to consume it. But then a faint sound reached its ears, a soft, lilting melody carried by the wind. It was unlike the cold voice of the lake or the mocking howl of the storm. This sound was warm, gentle, and alive. The dragon's head lifted, its faint hope rekindled. With trembling steps, it moved toward the sound, the music drawing it forward like a beacon. The forest loomed ahead, its skeletal trees cloaked in frost. Beyond their ghostly forms, the melody grew stronger. The dragon stumbled again, its strength waning, the frost creeping up its tail. As it reached the edge of the woods, it collapsed onto the frozen ground. The music ceased, and the night grew silent once more. Then came the light, a soft, golden glow breaking through the darkness. A figure emerged, tall and cloaked, with a lantern in hand. The dragon felt itself lifted, cradled in warm, gloved hands. "You're far from home, little one," the figure said, his voice low and kind. Through the haze of its exhaustion, the dragon saw the face of a young man, his eyes dark and filled with a sorrow it could not yet understand. The warmth of his lantern seeped into its body, chasing away the cold for a fleeting moment. The dragon trilled weakly, a sound both grateful and pleading. "Don't worry," the man murmured, his breath visible in the frozen air. "I'll keep you safe, but we must hurry. This forest has dangers of its own." And so the prince and the little dragon began their journey, their fates intertwined beneath the snowy night. The forest welcomed them with an eerie stillness. The trees, tall and ancient, stood like solemn sentinels, their frost-covered branches stretching skyward as if in supplication to a long-forgotten god. Snow clung to the prince's boots as he pressed forward, his lantern casting trembling pools of light that danced along the frozen ground. In his arms, the little dragon lay curled, its body trembling with cold that even the lantern's warmth could not fully dispel. The prince glanced down, his brows furrowing with concern. Its fragile frame seemed too delicate for the harshness of this winter-bound world, its silvery scales dulled by the frost creeping over them. Yet, there was something resilient in its shivering breath, a tiny flicker of determination. The prince adjusted his cloak, pulling it closer around the creature. "Stay awake, little one," he whispered, though his voice was lost in the wind's mournful wail. They moved deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, their skeletal forms casting strange shadows across the snow. The lantern's glow revealed fleeting glimpses of movement, branches shifting, snow falling. But the prince felt the weight of unseen eyes. The woods were alive in a way that sent a chill down his spine. The wind howled through the trees, its voice no longer a mere gust, but something ancient and alive, whispering words he could almost understand. The fire fades, the frost hungers. The prince's grip on the lantern tightened. "Ignore them," he said, though it wasn't clear whether he spoke to the dragon or to himself. The cold preys on fear, but the dragon, weak as it was, lifted its head. Its bright, glassy eyes reflected the shadows that swirled around them, and it let out a soft, keening trill. The sound made the prince stop in his tracks. The whispering voices grew louder, almost mocking. "You cannot save it, cursed prince. The warmth you carry is fleeting. Leave the beast to the frost, as you have left her all else." The prince's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he pushed forward, the lantern swaying in his hand. The path grew more treacherous, the snow deeper, and the trees pressing closer together. At times, the prince stumbled, but he never let the dragon slip from his arms. As they climbed over a fallen tree, the dragon stirred again, this time with more urgency. Its tail flicked weakly, and it let out a soft cry, turning its head toward the forest's depths. The prince followed its gaze and froze. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible beyond the shifting shadows. It was cloaked in tattered grey, its face obscured by a hood, but its presence was undeniable. "Who goes there?" the prince called, his voice steady despite the unease curling in his chest. The figure did not answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the faint outline of a path barely discernible in the snow. Then, without a sound, it vanished, swallowed by the darkness between the trees. The dragon chirped softly, as though urging the prince onward. He hesitated, glancing back the way they had come. The forest behind them seemed even darker, the whispering voices growing louder, their words less coherent, but no less unnerving. "There's no turning back, is there?" the prince murmured. The dragon blinked up at him, its tiny body trembling against the growing frost. With a sigh, the prince adjusted his hold on the lantern and stepped onto the faint path. The snow here was thinner, the ground harder, and the air carried a strange, almost electric charge. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faintest trace of starlight. As they walked, the prince spoke, his voice low and measured, as though speaking aloud might anchor them in this strange, shifting reality. "I was not always a wanderer," he said, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Once I ruled a kingdom where the winters were gentle, the snow soft and fleeting. But I was young and foolish, and I made choices that..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "The forest is my penance, my cage." The dragon tilted its head, its gaze unwavering despite its weariness. The prince chuckled bitterly. You want to know more? You'll have to survive the night, little one. If you do, I'll tell you the rest. Ahead, the path widened into a small clearing. In its center stood an ancient stone marked with strange glowing runes. The light from the prince's lantern dimmed as they approached, the fire within flickering uneasily. The prince stopped, his breath visible in the cold air. This, he said softly, is where the real journey begins. The dragon let out a faint trill, its gaze fixed on the stone. The runes pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the air around them grew warmer, just enough to keep the frost at bay. But the warmth came with a price, and the prince could feel it in his bones. The stone demanded something, though he did not yet know what. As the dragon curled tighter in his arms, the prince whispered, "Hold on, little one. We're not done yet." The wind quieted, the whispers fading into silence. But in the stillness, the prince felt the forest watching, waiting, as they stood on the brink of something neither could yet understand. The runes on the stone flared suddenly, a searing pulse of crimson that splintered the night's heavy silence. The prince stepped back instinctively, clutching the dragon tighter as the clearing was bathed in an eerie light. The warmth that had been so faint before now radiated from the stone, crawling over the snow and reaching towards them like unseen hands. The dragon stirred, lifting its head toward the pulsing runes. Its silver scales shimmered faintly in the glow, and for the first time, its breath came without a tremor. A tiny sound escaped it, a low, curious chirp. The prince's voice broke the stillness. "What do you see?" The dragon didn't answer, of course, but its gaze remained fixed on the stone. And then, as if in answer to some unspoken command, the light shifted. The runes unraveled, twisting into the air like burning threads, forming a path of glowing embers that stretched beyond the clearing into the depths of the forest. The prince hesitated, feeling the weight of the forest's gaze pressing down on him. He had wandered these woods for years, decades perhaps, but this path was new, and the firestones that marked it filled him with unease. The warmth you seek lies far away. The path is steep, the price to pay. The prince flinched as the whispering winds returned, their voices curling through the trees like smoke. The dragon chirped again, this time louder, its tail flicking with renewed energy. The prince felt its faint heat against his chest, a fragile ember that defied the frost. "We don't have a choice, do we?" he muttered. The dragon blinked up at him, its tiny face set with something almost like resolve. The prince stepped onto the path. Each firestone beneath his boots radiated a flickering warmth, melting the snow in a perfect circle around it. The air grew heavier as they moved forward, thick with the scent of smoke and something metallic. The forest closed in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The prince's steps slowed as the path curved sharply, descending into a narrow ravine. The firestones here glowed brighter, their light casting long shadows across the jagged rocks. The dragon let out a soft trill, its wings twitching as though it wanted to fly, but its body was still too weak. "Steady," the prince whispered, his own voice barely audible over the wind. He adjusted the lantern, its glow dimming in the presence of the firestones. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the path pressing against him. Then came the first obstacle. The wind sharpened into a howl, and the firestones flickered. Ahead, the path narrowed further, blocked by a wall of jagged ice. The light from the firestones reflected off its surface, creating an illusion of shifting, shadowy figures trapped within. The whispers returned, louder this time, their words biting like frost. "Turn back, cursed prince. You've lost before, and you will lose again. Your warmth cannot save what is already fading." The prince clenched his teeth, his free hand tightening around the lantern. "I've heard your lies before," he growled, though his voice betrayed the crack of doubt. The dragon chirped sharply, its tiny claws pressing into his arm. It turned its gaze toward the firestones, then back to the ice wall. The prince followed its line of sight, noticing for the first time that the firestones near the base of the wall glowed brighter, their heat melting faint trails through the frost. Understanding dawned. The path isn't blocked. It's testing us. The dragon let out a low, encouraging trill, and the prince lowered himself to the ground. Carefully, he extended his hand toward the firestones. As his fingers brushed their surface, a sharp heat surged through him, burning but not painful. The warmth spread into his arm, flowing into the dragon where it perched. The ice wall shuddered. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. The light from the firestones growing brighter. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, but the prince kept his focus, channeling the firestone's heat into the dragon. A sudden deafening crack split the air, and the ice wall shattered, its shards dissolving into harmless mist. The path continued beyond, its firestones glowing even more brightly now, as though acknowledging their triumph. The dragon lifted its head higher, its silver scales glinting with faint hues of gold. Its strength was returning, though the frost still clung stubbornly to its tail and wings. The prince exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the still frigid air. "One step closer," he murmured, rising to his feet. He glanced at the dragon, whose gaze was fixed on the path ahead. "You're braver than you look, little one." The forest seemed to retreat as they pressed on, the firestone path winding deeper into the unknown. But the air grew heavier still, and the prince knew their challenges were far from over. The whispers had fallen silent, but their absence was not comforting. Somewhere in the distance, the forest waited with bated breath, watching as the cursed prince and the fragile dragon walked toward a warmth neither fully understood. The firestone path led them into a part of the forest where the air itself seemed to freeze. The trees loomed closer together, their frost-covered branches forming a tangled canopy that blocked even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The glow of the firestones seemed dimmer here, as though their warmth was reluctant to linger. The prince's breath came in short, visible bursts, and his grip on the lantern tightened. The dragon rested in the crook of his arm, its faint warmth a fragile comfort against the encroaching cold. But his gaze was sharper now, its silvery eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. The path twisted sharply, leading them into a clearing unlike any they had encountered before. At its center stood an enormous mirror encased in frost. Its frame was jagged and raw, as though carved from the very ice that coated the ground. The surface of the mirror rippled, its reflection shifting like water stirred by an unseen hand. The prince stopped, his steps faltering. The air here was different, heavy, charged with a strange energy that prickled against his skin. The dragon let out a soft, questioning trill, its wings twitching faintly. "I know," the prince murmured, his voice low. "This is no ordinary mirror." The surface of the mirror shimmered, and a voice, cold and smooth as the ice beneath their feet, filled the clearing. "To proceed, you must face your truth. Show me the fire of your soul, or the frost will claim you both." The prince hesitated, his jaw tightening. He had faced many trials in this cursed forest, dangers both physical and spectral, but this was different. This was personal. The dragon slipped from his arm, landing unsteadily on the ground. It approached the mirror, its small claws clicking softly against the frost. The prince moved to stop it, but the dragon let out a sharp, determined chirp. The mirror's surface rippled, and the dragon's reflection appeared. But it was not as it was. The image showed the dragon frozen, its body encased in ice, its eyes wide and lifeless. The frost crept over its wings, its tail, until it was a perfect, tragic statue. The dragon let out a low, mournful trill, stepping back from the mirror as if trying to escape its own image. The prince knelt beside it, his hand resting gently on its trembling body. "It's showing your fear," he said softly. "The frost wants you to believe you're too small, too fragile to survive. But you're stronger than you think." The dragon looked up at him, its silver eyes glistening with something between fear and determination. It let out a faint, almost questioning chirp, and the prince nodded. "We have to face it. Together." He rose, turning to face the mirror. Its surface shifted again, the dragon's frozen image melting away. This time it showed the prince, tall and proud, dressed in the royal finery of a lifelong lost. But his eyes were hollow, and his hands were stained with shadow. Behind him, a kingdom lay in ruins, its towers crumbled, its people lost to the encroaching frost. The prince inhaled sharply, his heart pounding. The image was a cruel echo of his greatest failure, the choice that had bound him to this forest for eternity. "I know what you're trying to do," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "You want me to turn away, to let the frost win, but I've carried this guilt for years. It will not break me now." The mirror's surface rippled violently, the reflection distorting before shattering into 1,000 pieces. The shards fell silently to the ground, melting into harmless water before they touched the frost. The clearing grew brighter, the oppressive cold lifting slightly. The dragon chirped softly, nudging the prince's hand with its snout. "We're still standing," the prince said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "That's all that matters." The shattered mirror had revealed another path, its edges lined with faint, flickering firestones. The dragon's gaze followed the trail, its tail flicking with a renewed energy. "Forward, then," the prince murmured, lifting the dragon into his arms once more. The clearing faded behind them as they stepped onto the new path, the forest shifting once again around them. But the prince could not shake the weight of what he had seen. The reflection in the mirror had been a reminder of the choice he had made, the choice that had led to the ruin of his kingdom. And though he had spoken bravely, the guilt still coiled in his chest, as cold and unrelenting as the frost. The dragon, sensing his unease, let out a soft trill, its small claws gripping his sleeve. The prince glanced down, meeting its bright, unwavering gaze. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't let the past hold us. The dawn is coming, and we're not done yet." The firestones pulsed faintly beneath their feet, guiding them onward. Beyond the forest, the first faint glow of morning painted the horizon, but the frost still clung stubbornly to the edges of the world. The prince and the dragon moved forward, their shadows trailing long and dark behind them as the final hour approached. The firestones grew dimmer as the forest thinned, their embers pulsing faintly like a heartbeat on the edge of faltering. The path narrowed, leading to a frozen plateau, where the wind howled with an almost sentient malice. The horizon blushed with the first faint hint of dawn, a delicate line of gold cutting through the night's darkness. But the prince's heart sank. The light was distant, and the frost clung ever closer to the dragon in his arms. The little creature's scales, once glimmering silver, were dulled by ice creeping along its wings. Its breaths came shallower now, each exhale a fragile plume of mist. The dragon's once bright eyes were dim, yet it still looked to him with a trust that both humbled and haunted him. "We're so close," the prince murmured, his voice breaking against the cold. "Just hold on a little longer." Ahead, The firestones led to a spring bubbling faintly through the frost. Its water glowed softly, golden and warm, untouched by the icy grip of the forest. But the air around it was heavy with tension, as though the frost itself would strike if they dared draw near. The prince stepped forward. The dragon clutched tightly to his chest. The warmth of the spring reached him faintly, and he could feel the dragon stir, its tail flicking weakly. But as they approached, the ground trembled, and the frost around the spring swirled upward, forming a towering figure of ice. The figure was faceless, its form sharp and jagged, its voice a hollow echo that filled the plateau. "You have come far, cursed prince, but the warmth is not yours to give. The flame you carry is fleeting, and the frost will take what it is owed." The prince set the dragon down gently, its body limp but alive. He straightened, the lantern in his hand glowing faintly against the icy spectre. "You followed me through this forest, whispering doubts and fear," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But I've seen the truth of my failures, and I face the weight of my guilt. You will not stop us now." The frost figure tilted its head as if amused. "And what will you sacrifice, prince? What will you give to save what cannot last?" The prince looked down at the dragon. It was so small, so fragile, but his heart still beat, a faint ember refusing to extinguish. He knelt beside it, brushing the frost from its scales. The dragon's eyes opened weakly, meeting his. "I will give everything," the prince said softly. His words meant for the dragon as much as the frost. The spectre roared, its form expanding, the air around it freezing solid. The warmth of the spring dimmed, the water's glow flickering. The prince rose, his lantern trembling in his hand. The dragon let out a faint, pitiful chirp, and the prince's resolve hardened. He lifted the lantern, its glow intensifying. "You are the frost," he said, his voice low and commanding. "But I am the fire." With a sudden motion, he shattered the lantern against the ground. Its light exploded outward, a wave of golden warmth that surged through the plateau. The frost figure recoiled, its edges melting, its roar of fury fading into the wind. The warmth enveloped the dragon, its small body absorbing the light like dry kindling catching flame. Its scales shimmered, their dull silver replaced by hues of gold and crimson. Its wings stretched wide, melting the frost that clung to them, and its eyes burned with renewed life. The frost figure dissolved, its form crumbling into harmless snow. The spring's glow flared bright, its warmth spreading through the clearing. But the prince fell to his knees, his strength spent. The light from the lantern, the firestone warmth he had carried for so long, was gone, leaving only the cold. He smiled faintly as the dragon rose, its body no longer frail but strong, its wings powerful and glowing with inner fire. "You're free now," he whispered, his breath visible in the icy air. Live, little one. Carry the flame. The dragon let out a powerful cry, the sound echoing through the forest like a triumphant song. It turned to the prince, nuzzling him gently before spreading its wings. With a single mighty leap, it soared into the sky, its body a blazing streak against the dawn. The frost retreated, the warmth of the spring spreading outward, chasing the cold from the forest. The prince watched the dragon disappear into the horizon, a faint smile lingering on his lips. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the plateau, the prince's form shimmered, his body dissolving into golden light. His curse was lifted, his penance complete. And in the heart of the forest, where frost had once reigned supreme, the spring flowed freely, its warmth a lasting reminder of a small dragon's courage and a prince's ultimate sacrifice.